The blood on Bridget Morrison's hands had dried to a rust-brown color by the time the cowboy first noticed her, standing outside the mercantile in Eagar, Arizona, watching the supply wagon roll past without making a move to flag it down. It was late August in 1883, and the heat pressed down on the small mountain town like a heavy hand. Flynn Foster had ridden into Eagar 3 days prior, trailing a small herd of cattle he'd bought cheap in New Mexico territory. The town sat at over 7,000 feet elevation in the White Mountains, where ponderosa pines broke up the landscape and the air ran cooler than the desert valleys below. Flynn had planned to rest his animals here before pushing north toward Holbrook, but something about the quiet woman with blood on her hands made him pause at the hitching post instead of riding on. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark blonde hair pinned up in a way that suggested she'd done it hastily that morning. Her dress was simple calico, faded blue with small white flowers, and there was a tear in the sleeve that had been mended with careful stitches. What struck Flynn most was not her appearance, but her absolute stillness. She stood there in the morning sun like she was made of stone, watching that wagon pass with supplies she clearly needed, and she never once raised her hand or called out to the driver. Flynn was 26, tall and lean from years of hard work, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that needed cutting. He'd been working cattle since he was 14, had seen his share of suffering, and learned to read people the way he read weather patterns and animal behavior. Something about this woman's silent watching told him a story she wasn't speaking aloud. He tied his horse and walked slowly toward the mercantile, keeping his distance so as not to startle her. As he got closer, he could see the blood was on her palms and fingers, not fresh, but not old enough to have washed away completely. "Morning, miss," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat. She turned to look at him, with eyes the color of creek water, clear and brown-green in the mountain light. There was no fear in her expression, just a kind of watchful assessment. "Morning," she replied. Her voice was softer than he expected, with an accent that suggested she'd come from somewhere back east. "That wagon had supplies going to the general store," Flynn said, nodding toward where it had disappeared around the corner. "Were you waiting on something particular?" Bridget looked down at her hands, seemed to notice the blood for the first time in a while, and rubbed her palms against her skirt in a gesture that was more automatic than effective. "I was just watching," she said. Flynn studied her face. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of too little sleep and a tightness around her mouth that came from worry held too long. But she smiled slightly when she met his gaze again, as if to reassure him that everything was fine. "I'm Flynn Foster," he offered, "just passing through with some cattle." "Bridget Morrison." She glanced back toward the edge of town, where a small cabin sat among the pines, slightly separated from the other buildings. "I should get back. My father will need his breakfast." She turned to leave, and Flynn noticed she was limping slightly, favoring her right leg. She didn't mention it, didn't ask for help, just started walking with that uneven gait back toward the cabin. Flynn watched her go, his instincts telling him that something was very wrong in Bridget Morrison's life, but she would never be the one to say it out loud. Over the next few days, Flynn found reasons to stay in Eagar. His cattle needed rest, he told himself. The mountain grass was good, and he'd found a decent spot to graze them just outside town. But the truth was he couldn't stop thinking about the woman who never asked for anything. He began to pay attention in a way he'd never paid attention before. He watched from a distance, not wanting to intrude, but needing to understand. He saw Bridget walk to the well every morning at dawn, carrying 2 large wooden buckets. She never asked anyone for help with the heavy load, though several times men passed close enough to offer. She just smiled and said she was fine, then hauled those buckets back to her cabin with that slight limp slowing her down. He saw her at the general store one afternoon, counting coins in her palm very carefully. She put back the coffee she'd selected, then the sugar, then finally bought only a small sack of cornmeal and some lard. The storekeeper, an older man named Henry Walsh, had started to say something to her, but she'd smiled that same quiet smile and thanked him before he could finish. Flynn positioned himself near the door as she came out. "Miss Morrison," he said, "I hope this doesn't seem forward, but I've got some extra coffee in my supplies. My sister sent me more than any one man could drink before it goes stale. Would you be willing to take it off my hands?" Bridget looked at him with those clear eyes, and for a moment he thought she might see right through his lie. But then she just shook her head gently. "That's kind of you, Mr. Foster, but I couldn't." "It'll just go to waste," he pressed, keeping his voice casual. "Seems a shame." "I'm sure someone else in town could use it more than me," she said. And then she was walking away again, back toward that cabin in the pines. That evening, Flynn went to the small saloon that served as the town's gathering place. It wasn't rowdy like the saloons in bigger towns, just a place where men could get a beer and share news. He bought a drink and settled in near a group of local ranchers, listening to their conversation until he could steer it naturally toward the Morrison family. "Old Daniel Morrison," one man said, shaking his head. "Terrible thing. What happened to him? Used to be a fine carpenter, came out here from Pennsylvania about 5 years back with his daughter. Built half the houses in this town." "What happened?" Flynn asked. "Fell from a roof last spring," another man said. "Broke his back real bad. Can't walk now, can't work. That girl of his does everything for him, cooking, cleaning, trying to keep body and soul together on nothing." "She has any other family?" "Just him. Mother died when she was young, I heard. No brothers or sisters. And Daniel, he's a proud man. Won't accept charity, won't let his daughter accept it either. They're starving slowly up there in that cabin, and there's not a damn thing any of us can do about it, because every time we try to help, they refuse." Flynn felt something tighten in his chest. He'd seen pride before, had seen it kill people in the harsh Western territories. But he'd also seen something else in Bridget's face, something beyond pride. She wasn't refusing help out of stubbornness. She was refusing because she'd learned somewhere along the way that asking for things, needing things, was dangerous. The blood on her hands made sense now. She was probably hunting small game, trying to bring in meat to feed her father. The limp suggested an injury she was ignoring because there was no money for a doctor, the careful counting of coins, the putting back of supplies, the watching of wagons without calling out. It all painted a picture of a woman who had disappeared into the background of her own life, meeting needs silently while slowly erasing herself. Flynn had known women like this before. His own mother had been one after his father died and left them with debts and a failing farm. She'd worked herself to death rather than ask the neighbors for help, and Flynn had been too young to understand what was happening until it was too late. He was 14 when she died, 16 when he finally left that failed farm and started working cattle. He'd promised himself then that if he ever saw someone else drowning quietly, he'd find a way to throw them a rope, whether they asked for it or not. The next morning, Flynn went to the general store and spoke quietly with Henry Walsh. "I want to set up an account," he said, "for the Morrison family." Henry looked at him with knowing eyes. "They won't accept it. They don't need to know it's from me," Flynn said. "Tell them you've started a new policy. First $50 of goods for long-time residents is on credit, no interest, paid back whenever they can manage it. Make it sound like a business decision. And when they ask which other families got this offer, tell them you're starting with the folks who need it most. Make a list if you have to. I'll fund it for anyone you think needs the help." Henry was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's going to cost you more than $50. "I have it." Flynn did have it. He'd been careful with his money over the years, saved most of what he earned. The cattle drive would bring in good money when he sold the herd, and he had enough set aside to be comfortable for a while. "Why?" Henry asked. "You planning to stay in Eagar?" Flynn didn't have an answer to that. He just knew he couldn't ride away from Bridget Morrison and her quiet suffering. "Just do it," he said. Henry set it up that afternoon. Flynn watched from across the street as Bridget came to the store the next morning. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw Henry explaining something to her, saw her shake her head at first, then saw Henry persist. Finally, she nodded, though her expression was uncertain. She selected a few more items than usual, the coffee she'd passed on before, some beans, a bit of salt pork, and left with a fuller basket than Flynn had seen her carry yet. It was a start, but Flynn knew it wasn't enough. He began to watch more carefully, not in a way that would make her uncomfortable, but in a way that helped him understand what she needed beyond food. He saw that the cabin's roof had a section where the shingles were damaged, probably from the previous winter's snow. He saw that her shoes were worn through at the sole. He saw that she carried water with a slight tilt to her shoulders that suggested pain in her back. Flynn was a man of action, not words. He'd never been good at pretty speeches or elaborate courtship rituals, but he knew how to fix things, how to build things, how to make life a little easier through practical work. So, he started finding ways to help without being seen. He went to the cabin one evening when he knew Bridget had gone to the well. her father would be inside, unable to come to the door. Flynn worked quickly, replacing the damaged shingles he'd bought from the lumber yard. He was nearly finished when he heard her voice behind him. "Mr. Foster, what are you doing?" He turned to find her standing there with her buckets, looking up at him on the roof with an expression that was equal parts confusion and something he couldn't quite read. "Noticed your roof was damaged," he said simply. "Winter's coming in a few months. Snow gets heavy up here in the mountains." "I can't pay you for that work," Bridget said quietly. "Didn't ask you to." Flynn climbed down from the roof, his movements easy and practiced. "I'm a fair hand at carpentry, learned it from my grandfather, helps to keep in practice." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her trying to figure out what to say. Finally, she just asked, "Why?" It was the first real question he had heard her ask. Not a polite deflection or a quiet refusal, but an actual question that demanded an honest answer. Flynn took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, buying himself a moment to think. "I had a mother who never asked for help when she needed it," he said finally. "She died because of it. Left me and my younger sister to fend for ourselves. I learned something from that, Miss Morrison. I learned that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is let someone else help carry the load." Bridget's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My father," she started, then stopped. "He's a proud man. He doesn't want people to know how bad things have gotten." "I'm not people," Flynn said. "I'm just a cowboy passing through who happens to know how to fix roofs. No shame in that." "You're not just passing through, though, are you?" Bridget's voice was soft, but there was a sharpness to the question. "You were supposed to move your cattle north days ago. You're staying because of us." Flynn couldn't deny it. "I'm staying because I want to," he said. "Is that all right with you?" She looked down at the buckets in her hands, at the water sloshing slightly against the wooden sides. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know what you want from me." "Nothing," Flynn said, and he meant it. "I don't want anything from you, Miss Morrison, but I'd like to give you something, if you'll let me. I'd like to give you the freedom to stop carrying everything alone." Bridget's hands tightened on the bucket handles. "I don't know how to do that," she whispered. "Then let me teach you," Flynn said. He stepped forward and took the buckets from her hands before she could protest. "First lesson, when someone offers to carry water, you say thank you." For a moment he thought she might refuse, might take the buckets back and retreat into that shell of silent self-reliance. But then something in her face shifted, some barrier cracking just slightly, and she nodded. "Thank you," she said. It was the smallest victory, but Flynn felt it like warmth in his chest. He carried the water to her cabin, set the buckets by the door, and tipped his hat to her before leaving. He didn't go inside, didn't push for more than she was ready to give. This was going to be a slow process, he realized. Bridget Morrison had built her walls carefully over time, and they wouldn't come down in a day. Over the following weeks, Flynn settled into a pattern. He found work at a nearby ranch, helping with the late summer cattle work and earning enough to justify staying in Eagar. He sold his small herd for a decent price and put most of the money aside, keeping what he needed for living expenses and for the quiet help he continued to provide. He started showing up at the well in the mornings, timing it so he'd be there when Bridget arrived. At first she protested when he took her buckets, but he was patient and persistent, and eventually she began to expect him there. They'd walk back to her cabin together, not talking much at first, just sharing the silence of the early morning with the pine-scented air cool around them. Gradually, Bridget began to speak. Small things at first, comments about the weather, or observations about the birds in the trees. Flynn listened more than he talked, learning about her through these fragments of conversation. She'd been educated back east, had loved to read before her father's accident took away the money for books. She missed Pennsylvania sometimes, missed the green hills and the way spring came earlier there. But she loved the mountains of Arizona too. Loved the way the aspens turned gold in fall and the way the air smelled like pine sap and sunshine. Flynn learned that her father had been a different man before his fall, cheerful and energetic, always singing while he worked. Now he was bitter and in constant pain, dependent on his daughter for everything, and the shame of it ate at him. He refused to see visitors, refused to accept help, and Bridget was caught between honoring his wishes and keeping them both alive. "He talks about dying sometimes," Bridget told Flynn one morning as they walked. Her voice was matter of fact, but he could hear the pain underneath. "Says it would be better for everyone, especially for me." What do you say to that? Flynn asked quietly. I tell him I need him, Bridget said. I tell him I'm not ready to be alone in the world, and that's true, but it's also true that I'm so tired, Mr. Foster. I'm so tired of pretending everything is fine when it's not. I'm tired of being strong every single moment of every single day. Flynn stopped walking and set down the buckets. He turned to face her, and without thinking too hard about it, he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were rough with work, the nails cut short, and there was a fresh cut on her thumb that she probably didn't even remember getting. You don't have to pretend with me, he said. You don't have to be strong every moment. That's what I'm here for, Bridget, to give you moments where you can just be. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and he saw her react to it, saw something shift in her expression. She didn't pull her hand away. Why? She asked again, and this time the question was different. It wasn't defensive or confused. It was genuine curiosity, maybe even hope. Flynn knew this was the moment where he had to be honest, had to lay his cards on the table even though they'd only known each other a few weeks. Because from the first moment I saw you standing outside that mercantile, watching that wagon pass by, without asking for what you needed, I felt something I'd never felt before, he said. I felt like I'd found someone worth staying for, worth building something with. And I know that's fast. I know it doesn't make much sense, but I'm a simple man, Bridget. When I see something true, I don't waste time questioning it. Bridget's eyes were wide, and he could see she was struggling with how to respond. You don't really know me, she said finally. Then let me know you, Flynn said. Let me spend time with you. Let me help you and your father. Let me prove that you can trust someone to stay. She was quiet for a long time, looking at their joined hands. Finally, she said, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let someone in. Start small, Flynn suggested. Have dinner with me. Let me meet your father properly. Let me see your life, not just the pieces you show the outside world. Bridget took a shaky breath, and then she nodded. All right, she said. Come for dinner tonight, but I should warn you, my father can be difficult. I can handle difficult, Flynn said with a slight smile. That evening, Flynn arrived at the Morrison cabin with a basket of food he'd bought from the restaurant in town. He'd thought about bringing his own cooking, but he wanted Bridget to have one meal where she didn't have to labor over the stove. When she opened the door and saw the basket, her eyes filled with tears. You don't have to keep doing things like this, she said, but there was no real protest in her voice anymore. I know I don't have to, Flynn said. I want to. Daniel Morrison was in a chair by the window, a blanket over his legs despite the warm evening. He was a big man, or had been before the injury. Now he looked diminished, his shoulders hunched forward, his face drawn with pain. His hair was gray and unkempt, and his eyes were sharp with suspicion when Flynn entered. Who's this? Daniel asked his daughter, though he was looking at Flynn. This is Flynn Foster, Papa. He's been helping with some repairs around the place. I didn't ask for any repairs, Daniel said sharply. Flynn approached calmly and offered his hand. No, sir, you didn't. I offered them. I'm a fair carpenter, learned from my grandfather back in Missouri. Can't seem to break the habit of fixing things when I see them needing it. Daniel looked at Flynn's hand for a long moment before shaking it. His grip was still strong, Flynn noted. Whatever else the fall had taken from him, it hadn't taken all his strength. My daughter tells me you've been carrying water for her in the mornings, Daniel said. Yes, sir. Those buckets are heavy, and the walk is long. Seems the least I can do, since I'm up early anyway, with nowhere particular to be. We don't need charity, Mr. Foster. Good thing I'm not offering charity then, Flynn said easily. He pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited, a calculated move to show he wasn't intimidated. I'm offering friendship, and maybe, if your daughter is willing, I'm offering courtship. That got both their attentions. Bridget, who had been setting out the food, froze with a plate in her hands. Daniel's eyebrows rose sharply. Courtship, Daniel repeated. You've known my daughter for what, 3 weeks? About that, Flynn agreed. But I've seen enough in those 3 weeks to know she's the kind of woman a man would be lucky to build a life with. She's strong, she's smart, she's loyal to a fault, and she deserves someone who sees that and values it. And you think you're that someone? Daniel's voice was challenging. I think I'd like the chance to prove I could be, Flynn said honestly. But that's up to Bridget, not me. I'm just laying my intentions out clear so everyone knows where I stand. Bridget set the plate down carefully and came to stand beside her father's chair. Papa, she said softly, Flynn has been kind to us. He's helped us when we needed it, and he's never asked for anything in return. I think we should at least listen to what he has to say." Daniel looked up at his daughter, and Flynn saw something complicated pass across his face. Love, certainly, but also guilt and pain and a kind of desperate hope. "You like him?" Daniel asked her. Bridget's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. "I do," she said. "He makes me feel like maybe life doesn't have to be so hard all the time." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed heavily. "Sit down, Mr. Foster. Let's eat this food you brought and talk like civilized people." The dinner was not easy. Daniel's pride was a palpable thing, and he bristled at several points when Flynn mentioned repairs he wanted to make or ways he could help. But Flynn was patient, and Bridget gently mediated, and slowly the older man began to soften. By the time they'd finished eating, Daniel was telling stories about his carpentry work before the accident, and Flynn was listening with genuine interest, asking technical questions that showed he knew what he was talking about. "You really did learn from a carpenter," Daniel said at one point, sounding grudgingly impressed. "Yes, sir. My grandfather built barns and houses all over central Missouri. I worked with him every summer from the time I was 8 until he died when I was 12. After that, I turned more toward cattle work, but I've always kept up the carpentry skills." "Why cattle instead of building?" Flynn considered the question. "I like the moving," he said finally. "Or I did anyway. I like not being tied down to one place, liked seeing new country. But lately, I've been thinking maybe it's time to settle somewhere, find a place worth staying for." He looked at Bridget as he said it, and she looked back, and something passed between them that made Daniel clear his throat loudly. "Well," the older man said, "if you're serious about courting my daughter, you should know she's not some easy woman who will fall for pretty words. She's got a good head on her shoulders and a strong will. You'll have to earn her respect as much as her affection." "I wouldn't want it any other way," Flynn said. After that evening, things changed between Flynn and Bridget. The change was subtle, but significant. She began to smile more when she saw him, began to seek him out, rather than just accepting his presence. They fell into a routine of spending time together every day. He'd come in the mornings to carry water, and sometimes he'd stay for breakfast. In the evenings, he'd come by to help with whatever needed doing around the cabin, and often he'd stay for dinner. Daniel, despite his initial resistance, began to warm to Flynn. He started asking for his opinion on things, started treating him less like a stranger, and more like someone who might become family. Flynn was careful not to push too hard, but he made it clear he was in this for the long term. One afternoon in early October, Flynn took Bridget on a walk through the pine forests that surrounded Eagar. The aspens were turning gold, and the air had that crisp quality that promised winter was coming. They walked for over an hour, talking about everything and nothing, until they reached a clearing with a view down the valley. "This is beautiful," Bridget said, looking out over the landscape. The afternoon sun turned everything golden, and the mountains in the distance were blue-purple against the sky. "It is," Flynn agreed, but he was looking at her, not the view. "Bridget, I need to tell you something." She turned to face him, and he could see a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "I'm in love with you," Flynn said simply. "I know it's fast, I know we haven't known each other long, but it's true. I wake up every morning thinking about you. I go to sleep every night grateful I got to see you that day, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to face anything alone again." Bridget's eyes were bright with tears. "Flynn," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything back," he continued. "I just needed you to know, needed you to understand that when I help you, when I show up every day, it's not out of pity or obligation. It's because I love you, and I want to take care of you the way you've been taking care of everyone else." "I'm afraid," Bridget admitted. "I'm afraid to need someone. I'm afraid you'll leave, or something will happen, and I'll be alone again. I don't know if I'm strong enough to survive that." Flynn stepped closer and took both her hands in his. "Life doesn't come with guarantees," he said. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. But I can promise you this. I'm not leaving. I'm not walking away. Whatever comes, we face it together. You and me, Bridget. That's what I'm offering." She looked up at him, and he could see her struggling with the decision. He knew what he was asking of her. She'd spent so long protecting herself, building walls, learning not to need anything from anyone. He was asking her to tear all that down, to be vulnerable, to trust. Finally, she said, "I think I'm falling in love with you too. It terrifies me, but it's true. When you're around, everything feels lighter, more possible. Like, maybe I don't have to carry the world on my shoulders anymore. Flynn felt something warm and fierce expand in his chest. You don't, he said. Never again. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, kissing him back with a kind of desperate relief, like someone who'd been holding their breath for years and finally learned to breathe again. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Bridget laughed. It was the first time Flynn had heard her really laugh. Not just a polite chuckle, but a genuine sound of joy, and it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. What? He asked, smiling. I just realized I'm happy, she said wonderingly. Right now, in this moment, I'm actually happy. I'd almost forgotten what that felt like. Flynn pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on top of her head. Get used to it, he said. I plan on making you happy as often as possible. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms in the golden October afternoon, while the aspens rustled around them and the mountains stood eternal in the distance. The next few months tested them in ways neither had expected. Winter came hard to the mountains that year, with heavy snows that started in November and didn't let up. Flynn moved into the small barn beside the Morrison cabin, insisting he needed to be close by to help with the increased workload. Daniel protested at first, but Flynn pointed out that the water would freeze at the well, and someone would need to break the ice every morning. The old man finally agreed, on the condition that Flynn take meals with them and accept it as payment for his work. It was during those long winter months that Flynn and Bridget truly became partners. They worked together to keep the cabin warm, to make sure Daniel was comfortable, to stretch their supplies through the coldest months. Flynn brought in firewood every day, repaired things that broke, and made improvements to the cabin's insulation. Bridget cooked and cleaned and cared for her father, but now she had help, and the difference it made was visible in her face. The shadows under her eyes faded. She put on a little weight. She smiled more. Daniel's attitude shifted too. The pride that had made him refuse help began to transform into something healthier. With Flynn around, he started to feel less like a burden and more like a man again. Flynn would ask his advice on carpentry projects, would sit with him in the evenings and talk about building techniques and design ideas. Slowly, Daniel began to sketch plans for furniture, things he could build from his chair if someone else could do the physical labor. I've been thinking, Daniel said one evening in January, while snow fell thick outside the windows. If you and Flynn are going to get married, you'll need a bigger house. This cabin is barely big enough for 2 people, let alone 3. Bridget, who was mending a shirt by lamplight, looked up sharply. Papa, Flynn hasn't asked me to marry him. Yet, Flynn added from where he sat, working on a piece of harness leather. Haven't asked yet. Bridget's cheeks colored, but she was smiling. You're both presuming quite a lot. Am I wrong? Daniel asked his daughter directly. Are you planning to marry this man? Bridget looked at Flynn, and he looked back, and the answer was clear in both their eyes. Yes, she said softly. If he asks, I'll say yes. Then I'm not presuming, Daniel said with satisfaction. I'm planning, and I'm telling you, this cabin won't do. You'll want your own place, and I won't have you living in cramped quarters because you feel obligated to stay with me. Papa, we'd never leave you alone, Bridget protested. I'm not asking you to leave me alone. I'm asking you to think about the future. Build a house nearby, something with enough room for a family. I can stay here in the cabin, and you can check on me as much as you want. But you need to start your own life, daughter. I won't be the thing that holds you back. Flynn set down the leather he was working on. Mr. Morrison, I've been thinking about this too. What if we built an addition to this cabin, made it bigger, added a couple rooms? That way we'd all be under the same roof, but there'd be more space, more privacy. Daniel considered this. That could work, he admitted. But it would be a lot of labor. Can't start until spring anyway, with all this snow. Spring is coming, Flynn said. And when it does, we'll start building, together. You can design it, I'll do the physical work, and Bridget can keep us both organized and fed. You'd trust me to design your house? Daniel asked, and there was something vulnerable in the question. I'd be honored, Flynn said simply. You're one of the best carpenters in the territory. Everyone says so. Daniel's eyes were bright with emotion. All right then, he said gruffly. I'll start sketching plans tomorrow. But Flynn, before we start building a house together, "There's something you need to do." "What's that, sir?" "You need to formally ask for my daughter's hand. I'm old-fashioned that way. You want to marry her? You ask me first." Flynn stood up, understanding the moment for what it was. This wasn't about old-fashioned traditions. This was about Daniel giving his blessing, about feeling included in his daughter's future, rather than being bypassed by it. "Daniel Morrison," Flynn said formally, "I love your daughter more than I thought it was possible to love another person. She's the strongest, kindest, most capable woman I've ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to her that she doesn't have to carry everything alone anymore. I promise to honor her, to support her, to work beside her, and build a life with her. I promise to never take her for granted, or assume she doesn't need what she's too proud to ask for. And I promise to take care of you as part of our family for as long as you need us. Will you give me your blessing to marry her?" Daniel's weathered face was working with emotion. "You're a good man, Flynn Foster," he said, his voice rough. "Better than I had any right to hope for my girl. Yes, you have my blessing. Take care of her. Make her happy." "Every day," Flynn promised. Bridget had set down her mending and was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. But she was smiling too, radiant with joy. Flynn turned to her and crossed the room, dropping to one knee beside her chair. He took her hand, rough and work-worn, and kissed her knuckles gently. "Bridget Morrison, will you marry me? Will you let me love you for the rest of our lives? Will you trust me to be your partner, your friend, your family?" "Yes," Bridget said through her tears. "Yes to all of it. I love you, Flynn. I love you so much." He stood and pulled her up into his arms, kissing her, while her father looked on with wet eyes and a smile on his weathered face. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the small cabin, there was only warmth and joy and the promise of a future built together. They were married in April of 1884, when the snow had melted and the meadows around Eagar were full of wildflowers. It was a simple ceremony in the small church at the center of town, attended by most of the residents. Bridget wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric Flynn had bought, cream-colored with blue flowers embroidered at the collar and cuffs. Flynn wore his best shirt and pants, his boots polished, his hair finally cut. Daniel Morrison sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter marry the man who had saved them both. The whole town knew the story by now, the mysterious cowboy who had paid for supplies secretly, who had fixed their roof and carried their water, who had loved Bridget before she knew how to accept love. It had become something of a legend in Eagar, the kind of story people would tell for years to come. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the town hall. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing and food and laughter. Flynn danced with his new wife, holding her close and whispering in her ear about all the years they had ahead of them. "I still can't believe this is real," Bridget said, her head on his shoulder as they swayed to the music. "That I get to be this happy." "Believe it," Flynn said. "This is your life now, our life. What if I wake up and it's all been a dream? Then I'll be right there to remind you it's real. Every single day, Bridget. I'm not going anywhere." She pulled back to look at him, and her eyes were serious. "I never knew how to ask for what I needed," she said. "I learned so young that asking was dangerous, that showing need made you vulnerable. My father used to hit my mother when she asked for things, money for food, help with the work, anything. She learned to stop asking, and then she taught me to never ask either. After she died, I just kept doing what she'd done, being invisible, needing nothing." Flynn's jaw tightened. "He hit her?" "It's part of why we left Pennsylvania. After she died, he changed. Felt guilty, I think. He never touched me in anger, but I'd already learned the lesson. Don't ask, don't need. Just survive." "I'm sorry," Flynn said, pulling her close again. "I'm sorry you learned that, and I'm sorry your mother lived that way. But Bridget, that's over now. You can need things. You can ask me for anything, and I'll never make you feel small for it. That's my promise to you." She was crying again, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I know," she whispered. "You've been showing me that since the day we met. You saw what I needed before I could ask for it. You taught me it was safe to need someone." They danced until late into the night, surrounded by their community, celebrated by people who had watched their love story unfold. And when they finally went back to the Morrison cabin, now expanded with 2 new rooms that Flynn and Daniel had built together over the past month, they were exhausted but happy. The new rooms included a bedroom for Flynn and Bridget, with windows that looked out over the pine forests, and a larger living area that gave everyone more space. Daniel's room remained where it had always been, on the ground floor with everything he needed within reach. It wasn't a mansion, but it was home, built with love and care and the promise of a future. That first night as husband and wife, Flynn and Bridget lay in their new bed, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl. Bridget was curled against Flynn's side, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me, for noticing what I wouldn't say out loud, for loving me enough to pay attention." Flynn kissed the top of her head. "That's the easy part," he said. "Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had found each other against the odds and built something real and lasting. The years that followed were good ones. Flynn found steady work with several of the larger ranches in the area, while also doing carpentry work on the side. He and Daniel became true partners, with the older man designing projects and Flynn executing them. They built furniture, repaired buildings, and slowly earned a reputation as the team to hire if you wanted quality work. Bridget flourished in ways that amazed everyone who had known her during those hard years. With the weight of survival lifted from her shoulders, she discovered parts of herself she'd forgotten existed. She had a gift for gardening and turned the area around their cabin into a productive vegetable plot that kept them fed through the summers. She started a small business doing mending and alterations for the town's residents, work she could do at home while still being available for her father. More importantly, she learned to laugh. Flynn made it his mission to bring joy into her life, to remind her daily that she deserved happiness. He brought her wildflowers he found on his rides. He read to her in the evenings from books he bought or borrowed. He listened when she talked about her dreams and fears, and he never once made her feel foolish for having either. Daniel's health stabilized. He would never walk again, but the constant pain that had made him bitter began to ease. A traveling doctor who came through Eagar in the fall of 1884 gave him medicine that helped, and with Flynn and Bridget's care, he found a new purpose in his design work. He spent his days sketching plans for buildings, furniture, and improvements, and his evenings with his family, telling stories and offering hard-won wisdom. In the spring of 1885, Bridget discovered she was pregnant. She told Flynn one evening when they were alone in their room, her voice nervous but excited. "Are you sure?" Flynn asked, his hands going to her still flat stomach. "As sure as I can be. I haven't bled in 3 months, and I've been sick every morning. The doctor confirmed it yesterday when he was in town." Flynn felt his eyes fill with tears. "We're going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "Bridget, we're going to be parents." She laughed at his expression. "You look terrified." "I am terrified," he admitted. "What if I'm no good at it? What if I don't know what to do?" "Then you'll do what you've always done," Bridget said, taking his face in her hands. "You'll pay attention. You'll notice what's needed. You'll be there, steady and constant. That's all any child really needs, Flynn, to be seen and loved and shown up for." He kissed her then, pouring all his love and fear and hope into the kiss. "I love you," he said. "I love you, and I love this baby already." "Good," Bridget said with a smile, "because there's going to be a lot of dirty diapers and sleepless nights ahead. I'll need you paying close attention to what I need. Always," Flynn promised. "Always." When they told Daniel the news, the old man wept openly. "A grandchild," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought I'd never see the day. I thought my injury had taken everything from us. But look at us now. Look at what we've built." The pregnancy was not easy. Bridget was sick for the first 4 months, barely able to keep food down. But Flynn was there every morning, holding her hair back when she was ill, bringing her dry toast and weak tea, rubbing her back until the nausea passed. He took over more of the household work, insisting she rest. And when she protested that she was perfectly capable of doing her share, he reminded her gently that letting him help wasn't weakness. "I know you're strong enough to do it all yourself," he said, "but you don't have to. That's the whole point, remember? We're in this together." As her belly grew, Flynn became even more attentive. He noticed when her back hurt and would spend an hour rubbing the sore muscles. He noticed when her feet swelled and would elevate them on pillows. He noticed when she got that faraway look in her eyes and would ask what she was thinking about. I'm thinking about my mother, Bridget admitted one evening in late summer, her hands on her rounded stomach. Wishing she could be here to meet her grandchild, wishing I could ask her questions about what to expect. What would you want to ask her? Flynn asked. I don't know. Practical things, I guess. How to care for a newborn, how to know what they need, but also deeper things. How to be a good mother, how to make sure this child feels loved and safe every day of their life. You're going to be an amazing mother, Flynn said with absolute certainty. You're patient and kind and strong, and you know what not to do, which is sometimes more important than knowing what to do. What do you mean? You know not to make your child feel like they can't ask for things. You know not to teach them that needing help is weakness. You're going to raise a child who understands that asking for what they need is healthy and good. And I'm going to be right there beside you, making sure both of you always know you're loved. Bridget leaned against him, feeling the baby move under her hands. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, she said. That I get to have this. You and our baby and a real home. It feels like a miracle. You deserve every bit of it, Flynn said fiercely. Every single bit of happiness and more. Their son was born in November of 1885, during the first snowfall of the season. The labor was long and difficult, and Flynn spent the entire time pacing outside the bedroom where the town's midwife attended Bridget. Daniel sat in his chair by the fire, pretending to sketch, but mostly just staring at the closed bedroom door. When the baby's first cry rang out, both men jumped. The midwife opened the door a few minutes later, smiling. You have a healthy son, she said, and your wife did wonderfully. She's tired but fine. Flynn rushed into the room to find Bridget pale and exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him, with tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling the biggest smile he'd ever seen. Look at him, she whispered. Flynn, look at our son. Flynn approached carefully, as if he might break the moment if he moved too fast. He looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets, the small features, the shock of dark hair. His son, his, and Bridget's son. He's perfect, Flynn said, his voice choked with emotion. Bridget, he's absolutely perfect. Do you want to hold him? Flynn nodded, unable to speak. Bridget carefully transferred the baby to his arms, and Flynn looked down at his son, feeling his entire world shift and reorganize itself around this tiny person. This was what life was about. This was what mattered. Family, love, being there for the people who needed you. Hello, little one, Flynn said softly. I'm your papa, and I promise you right now, I'm going to spend every day of your life making sure you know you're loved. I'm going to pay attention to what you need, even when you're too small to ask for it. I'm going to be there, always. The baby yawned, a tiny, perfect yawn, and settled more deeply into sleep. Bridget was watching them both, her eyes full of love. What should we name him? She asked. They had discussed names before, but hadn't decided on anything definite. Flynn looked at his son, then at his wife, then thought about Daniel in the other room, probably dying to meet his grandson. What about calling him James? Flynn suggested. After your mother's father, the one you told me used to bring you books and tell you stories. Bridget's eyes filled with fresh tears. You remembered that. I remember everything you tell me, Flynn said. That's my job, to pay attention. James Daniel Morrison Foster, Bridget said, trying out the name. It's perfect. It honors both our families. They called Daniel in then, and the old man wheeled his chair to the bedside, with an expression of wonder on his weathered face. Flynn carefully placed baby James in his grandfather's arms, and Daniel looked down at the baby with tears streaming down his face. He's beautiful, Daniel said. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you, both of you. Thank you for giving me this. They sat together like that for a long time, 3 generations of family in that small room, while snow fell gently outside and the fire crackled in the hearth. It was a perfect moment, the kind that gets remembered and treasured for a lifetime. Baby James was a good baby, though he had his fussy moments like any infant. Flynn was involved in every aspect of his care, something that surprised some of the other men in town but seemed natural to him. He changed diapers, walked the floor with James when he cried at night, learned to mix the milk just right when Bridget was too exhausted to nurse. He paid attention to the small signs that the baby needed something, the particular cry that meant he was hungry versus the one that meant his diaper was wet, the way he would root against Bridget's shoulder when he wanted to be fed, the specific fussiness that meant he needed to be burped. "How do you know all this?" Bridget asked one night when Flynn had diagnosed the problem gas before she'd even figured it out herself. "I watch him," Flynn said simply, gently patting James's back until he let out a satisfying burp. "I pay attention to what he's trying to tell us. Same way I learned to pay attention to what you needed back when we first met." Bridget felt her heart swell with love for this man who had taught her that being seen and cared for wasn't something to fear, but something to treasure. "You're a wonderful father," she said. "I'm trying," Flynn said, settling the now content baby back into his cradle. "I want him to grow up knowing he can always come to us with anything, that we'll always be watching out for him, even when he doesn't ask." As James grew from infant to toddler, Flynn's attentiveness never wavered. He noticed when James was starting to get sick before the symptoms fully appeared. He noticed when the boy was scared of something, but trying to be brave. He noticed when James was curious about something and would take time to explain it or show it to him. Daniel thrived in his role as grandfather. Despite his physical limitations, he became one of James's favorite people. The boy would sit in his grandfather's lap for hours while Daniel told stories or showed him drawings. Daniel designed and Flynn built a special collection of wooden toys for James' blocks that fit together in interesting ways, a small wagon that could be pulled around, carved animals that could stand on their own. The years passed in a rhythm of work and family, of seasons changing in the mountains around Eagar. Flynn continued to work with cattle and do carpentry. Bridget's mending business grew, and she also started teaching some of the town's children to read and write in a small, informal school she ran from their expanded cabin. James grew into a bright, curious boy with his mother's clear eyes and his father's steady temperament. In the spring of 1889, Bridget discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, though she was more tired with an active 3-year-old to care for. Flynn stepped up as always, taking James on long walks so Bridget could rest, handling more of the household chores, making sure she ate well and didn't overdo it. Their daughter was born in December of 1889, a tiny thing with a shock of blonde hair and lungs that could wake the whole town when she wanted to be fed. They named her Margaret Rose, and she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger from the first moment he held her. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone fall in love so fast," Bridget teased one evening, watching Flynn rock Margaret while James played with his wooden blocks nearby. "She's perfect," Flynn said, not looking away from his daughter's face. "Look at her tiny fingers. How is anything this small even possible?" James came over to investigate his baby sister. "She's very loud," he observed. "She is," Flynn agreed. "But you were loud too when you were a baby. It's how babies tell us what they need." "Like how Mama doesn't ask for things, but you know what she needs anyway?" James asked, with the logic of a 3-year-old making connections. Flynn and Bridget exchanged a surprised look. "Where did you hear that?" Bridget asked her son. "Grandpa told me. He said Papa is special because he pays attention to what people need even when they don't say it. He said that's how Papa and Mama fell in love." Flynn felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your grandpa is right," he said. "That is how we fell in love. And it's an important thing to remember, James. Always pay attention to the people you love. Watch for what they need. Don't wait for them to ask." "I can do that," James said seriously. "I'm good at watching things." "You are," Flynn agreed. "You're good at lots of things." That night, after both children were asleep and Daniel had retired to his room, Flynn and Bridget lay in bed together, talking quietly about their life. "Did you ever imagine we'd have all this?" Bridget asked. "When I think back to that day you first saw me at the mercantile, when I was so tired and so alone, I can barely recognize that version of myself." "You're still the same person," Flynn said. "You're just not carrying everything alone anymore." "No, I'm not, and I'm so grateful for that. For you." She turned to face him in the darkness. "You saved my life, Flynn Foster. Not in some dramatic, heroic way, but in the everyday way that matters most. You saw me when I was invisible. You cared when I thought no one did. You taught me that being vulnerable wasn't weakness and that asking for help wasn't failure. You saved mine too," Flynn said. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, going from place to place, job to job, never putting down roots. You gave me a reason to stay. You gave me a home." They kissed, tender and familiar, after years of marriage, and fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms. The years continued to unfold. James and Margaret grew, Daniel continued to design beautiful things while Flynn built them, and Bridget's small school attracted more students until she had nearly 15 children coming to their cabin several times a week for lessons. The family prospered, not wealthy but comfortable, building a life based on hard work, mutual support, and genuine love. Daniel passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1893, just after Christmas. He had lived to see his grandson turn 8 and his granddaughter turn 4. He had seen his daughter happy and secure, had rebuilt his relationship with her into something based on love and respect rather than guilt and duty. His last words to Flynn, spoken the evening before he died, were simple. "You kept your promises, all of them. Thank you for giving my girl the life she deserved." They buried him in the small cemetery outside Eagar, under the pines he had loved. The whole town came to pay their respects to Daniel Morrison, the carpenter who had designed half their homes and furniture. But Flynn knew the old man's greatest work hadn't been any building. It had been raising Bridget and then having the wisdom to step back and let Flynn love her the way she deserved to be loved. Bridget grieved deeply for her father, but she grieved in a healthy way, surrounded by family who let her feel what she needed to feel. Flynn was there for every tear, every memory, every moment when she needed to talk about her father or just needed to be held. He didn't try to fix her grief or rush her through it. He just paid attention to what she needed day by day and gave it to her. "I'm so glad he got to see this," Bridget said one evening a few weeks after the funeral, gesturing around their cabin at the life they had built. "He got to see me happy. He got to know his grandchildren. He got to have a purpose again, with all his design work. Those last years were good years for him." "They were," Flynn agreed. "You gave him that. You and your fierce loyalty, your willingness to care for him even when it was hard. He knew how loved he was." "We gave it to him together," Bridget corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you." As their children grew older, Flynn and Bridget made sure to pass on the lessons they had learned. They taught James and Margaret to pay attention to others, to notice what people needed, to offer help without being asked. They taught them that asking for help was a sign of trust, not weakness. They taught them that love wasn't just about grand gestures, but about showing up every day and being present for the people who mattered. James grew into a thoughtful young man, with his father's practical skills and his mother's intelligence. Margaret was spirited and curious, always asking questions and pushing boundaries in ways that reminded Flynn of Bridget when she finally allowed herself to express what she wanted. In the spring of 1898, when James was 12 and Margaret was 8, Bridget discovered she was pregnant again. At 37, this pregnancy was harder than the previous ones, and there were complications that worried the doctor. Flynn became even more attentive, barely letting Bridget lift a finger, taking over running her school along with his other work, making sure she rested and stayed healthy. "I'm not made of glass," Bridget protested one afternoon when Flynn insisted she stay in bed rather than help with dinner. "I know you're not," Flynn said calmly. "But the doctor said you need to rest, and I'm going to make sure you do. I didn't spend the last 14 years learning to take care of you just to stop now." Their second daughter was born in November of 1898, tiny but healthy, with her mother's dark blonde hair and her father's light brown eyes. They named her Caroline Grace, and she completed their family in a way none of them had known they needed. The turn of the century found the Foster family prosperous and deeply happy. Flynn was now 43, still strong and capable, working as a foreman for one of the larger ranches while continuing his carpentry on the side. Bridget was 40, running a successful school that had moved into its own building in town, teaching not just children, but also adults who wanted to learn to read and write. James was a teenager working alongside his father and learning the skills that would let him make his own way in the world. Margaret was in that wild period between childhood and adolescence, all energy and opinions and fierce love. And Caroline was a toddler, charming everyone she met with her sunny disposition. One evening, in the summer of 1901, Flynn and Bridget sat on the porch of their cabin, expanded twice more over the years to accommodate their growing family. The children were inside, James helping Margaret with her mathematics, while Caroline played with the wooden dolls Daniel had carved years before. "Do you remember that first morning at the well?" Bridget asked, her hand in Flynn's. "When you took my buckets without asking?" "I remember everything about those early days," Flynn said. "I remember thinking you were going to disappear if someone didn't see you soon. You were fading away, becoming invisible, and it scared me. I was invisible, Bridget said. I'd made myself that way because it felt safer than being seen. Being seen meant being vulnerable, and I couldn't afford vulnerability. And now? Now I know that being seen by the right person is the greatest gift in the world. You saw me, Flynn. You saw what I needed before I could ask for it. You taught me that I was worth caring for, worth showing up for. You changed my entire life. Flynn brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. The gesture is tender now as it had been 18 years ago when he first asked her to marry him. You changed mine too. You gave me a purpose, a home, a family, everything that matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The air was cool and smelled of pine sap and wood smoke from someone's chimney in town. From inside the cabin came the sound of their children's voices, Margaret laughing at something James said, Caroline babbling happily. I want them to remember this, Bridget said. Not just our family, but what we've taught them. About paying attention to people, about seeing what's needed even when it's not asked for, about showing up for the people you love. They will, Flynn said with certainty. We're not just telling them these things. We're living them every day. That's what they'll remember. That's what they'll carry forward. Do you think we did it right? Bridget asked. Raising them? I think we did our best, Flynn said. We loved them, we showed up for them, we paid attention to what they needed. That's all anyone can do. Bridget leaned her head on his shoulder, and Flynn wrapped his arm around her, holding her close the way he'd been holding her close for nearly 2 decades. They'd built something real together, something that would last beyond their own lives, a family based on attention and care and the radical act of seeing each other clearly. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. James fell in love with a local girl named Sarah and married her when he was 22, building a house near his parents' cabin and starting his own carpentry business. Margaret surprised everyone by becoming passionately interested in medicine and leaving Eagar to train as a nurse in Tucson, though she came home often to visit. Caroline grew into a bright young woman with a gift for teaching, taking over more and more of her mother's school as Bridget began to slow down in her 50s. Flynn and Bridget grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. But they remained devoted to each other, still in love after all those years, still paying attention to what the other needed. Flynn still brought Bridget wildflowers when he found them on his rides. Bridget still made Flynn his favorite meals and listened to his stories with genuine interest. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed goodnight every evening, still chose each other every single day. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1914, their whole family gathered at the cabin to celebrate. James and Sarah had brought their 3 children. Margaret had come home from Tucson with fascinating stories about her work at the hospital. Caroline was there with her fiancé, a young schoolteacher from Springerville. The cabin was full of noise and laughter and love. 3 generations of family built on the foundation Flynn and Bridget had laid all those years ago. That evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, Flynn and Bridget sat on their porch again, in the same spot where they'd sat so many times over the years. Flynn was 67 now, still strong but moving a bit slower. Bridget was 63, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes still clear and bright. 30 years, Bridget said wonderingly. How is it possible it's been 30 years? Feels like yesterday and forever at the same time, Flynn said. I can still see you standing outside that mercantile, watching that wagon pass. I can still remember thinking I'd found something worth staying for. I'm glad you stayed, Bridget said. I'm glad you saw me when I couldn't see myself. I'm glad you loved me enough to pay attention to what I needed, even when I was too scared to ask for it. Best decision I ever made, Flynn said simply. They sat in silence for a while, comfortable in each other's presence the way only people who have spent decades together can be. Finally, Bridget spoke again. I want you to know something, Flynn Foster, in case I don't say it enough. You saved my life, not just physically, though that's true too. You saved my soul. You taught me that I was worth loving, worth caring for, worth showing up for. You taught me that being vulnerable wasn't weakness, but courage. You taught me that asking for help wasn't failure, but trust. You gave me everything that matters: love, family, purpose, joy. And I have been grateful for you every single day of these 30 years. Flynn felt tears prick his eyes. Even after all this time, Bridget could move him with her words, with her fierce love, with the way she saw him as clearly as he'd always seen her. "And you gave me a reason to stay in one place," he said. "You gave me roots after years of drifting. You gave me children and grandchildren and a life worth living. You let me love you, Bridget, and that was the greatest gift I ever received." They kissed then, tender and sweet, two people who had built something lasting and true. Two people who had learned together that love wasn't just about passion or grand gestures, but about the daily choice to see each other clearly, to pay attention to what was needed, to show up even when it was hard. The stars came out above them, bright and clear in the mountain air. From inside the cabin came the sound of their grandchildren laughing, the sound of their children talking quietly, the sound of family. It was everything Flynn had hoped for when he first decided to stay in Eagar, Arizona, all those years ago, for a woman who never asked for anything. Flynn and Bridget lived many more years together, watching their family grow and expand. They saw James's children grow up and start families of their own. They saw Margaret eventually return to Eagar and open a small clinic where she cared for the town's residents with the same attentive care her father had taught her. They saw Caroline marry her school teacher and continue the tradition of education that Bridget had started all those years ago. When Flynn passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1923 at the age of 76, with Bridget holding his hand, he left behind a legacy of love and attention that touched 3 generations. The whole town of Eagar came to his funeral, sharing stories of how Flynn had helped them, over the years always noticing what was needed, always showing up, always caring. Bridget lived 3 more years after Flynn's death, sustained by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom had learned from their parents and grandparents the importance of paying attention to the people you love. She spoke often of Flynn in those final years, telling stories to anyone who would listen about the cowboy who had taught her that being seen was not something to fear, but something to treasure. When Bridget passed away in 1926 at the age of 75, she was buried beside Flynn in the cemetery under the pines. Their gravestone was simple, carved by one of James's sons who had inherited his great-grandfather, Daniel's gift, for working with wood and stone. It read, "Flynn and Bridget Foster. They saw each other clearly and loved each other well." And in Eagar, Arizona, for generations to come, people told the story of the cowboy who learned to pay attention to what was needed, and the woman who learned it was safe to be seen. It became the kind of story that reminded people what love really meant, not just passion or romance, but the daily choice to show up for each other, to notice what was needed even when it wasn't asked for, to see each other clearly through all the years and seasons of life. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried forward the lessons Flynn and Bridget had taught them, creating ripples of attention and care that spread through their community and beyond. The simple act of one man noticing one woman's silent needs had created a legacy of love that touched countless lives and reminded people that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pay attention to what someone needs, even when they never ask for it. And so, the story ended as all good stories do, with love lasting beyond lifetimes, with lessons passed down through generations, with 2 people who had found each other against the odds and built something beautiful and true that would never be forgotten.